Allow me to call for the next session. We've had our tea. Great session in the first one. Thank you very much to our moderator for taking us through that one. Mr. Ambrogio Rinaldi, thank you. I'm going to call on now our session number 2. Design and delivery of adequate DC pensions, a roundtable on challenges and solutions in the African continent. And I'd like to call on our moderator, Dr. Grace Muradzikwa, Commissioner, Insurance and Pensions Commission of Zimbabwe. Let's give her a big round of applause, please. I just need to make sure that after the break, we're all alive and present. A big round of applause, please. Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you very much. And our speakers, Dr. Farouk Aminu, the Executive Director, Commissioner, National Pension Commission, PENCOM, Nigeria. There we go. Yes, please, do not get tired. Just clap hands. Thank you very much, Dr. Farouk. Mr. Prakash, I will end at Prakash. The Chief Operating Officer, Financial Services Commission, all the way from Mauritius. I'm sure he will give us the pronunciation, but I will try. Can I try? I don't want to. In English. This is not English. Seewoosunkur. Oh, great. Seewoosunkur. Thank you, sir. And then Mr. Gandidzanwa, Director, UK-Headquartered Association of Professional Fund Investors, APFI, and Director and Principal at Risk and Investment Management Consulting Actuaries based in South Africa. Let's give him a big round of applause as he comes through. Again, let's plug in robust conversations. Let's contribute. Let's all be alive and make sure that this is a successful conversation, which will be moderated by Dr. Grace. Over to you, Dr. Grace.
So a very good afternoon once again. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you to our roundtable discussion on African challenges and solutions on the design and delivery of adequate pension funds. So to unpack the topic, we have, as you can see, 3 luminary speakers who are practitioners on the African continent. And I think in the interest of time, their bios have been shared. I'm not going to spend time sharing their bios. But I'll just introduce them as they come to speak. So allow me just to set the scene in a few minutes. I think just to give context to African occupational pensions industry for the benefit of participants who are not familiar with the African context. I'll briefly highlight the topical issues that are affecting us on the African continent. We are seized with design issues. And from a pension fund design perspective, African markets are seized with the conversion of funds from DB to DC in response to funding gaps and sustainability challenges. We also seized with provision of post-retirement healthcare benefits, extending pension coverage to the informal sector in Africa, calling for flexibility and redesigning the pensions to accommodate the informal sector. There's growing pressure from members for partial access of pension savings, particularly in the post-COVID environment in Africa. Some pure DC schemes are also offering annuities from within the funds as part of value proposition to their members. And I'm aware that this also has its own pros and cons. Relevance of nominal guarantees to DC schemes, deposit administration schemes, guaranteed funds in the operating environments, particularly in view of inflationary pressures. We also seized with some governance issues around pension funds, And in terms of governance, topical issues on our African market include the cost of running pension funds and the implications on achieving member outcomes, the quality of trustees and their fiduciary responsibility to fund members. The data integrity issues, I thought these were peculiar to Africa, but I think as Ali shared, it seems, I think these are global issues. I used to think that they are African issues. I personally struggled to get statistics on the African private occupational pension funds industry as part of our preparation for this session. So really calling for urgent attention, to this matter. There's also the issue about the impact of technology on modern pension and retirement funds. And lastly, around investment. In terms of pension fund investments, most African countries are seized with the following issues. There is ongoing debate on investment regulation versus deregulation, the risks and rewards of pension fund investments in infrastructure projects, the sustainability investments as part of pension fund governance, inactive capital markets, and I'm really happy that our capital markets regulator is here with us, and limited investment options, and lastly, increasing interest in alternative investments as an asset class. So what I'm going to do is to manage time. We have about 1 hour, 30 minutes. I'm going to give our presenters strictly 15 minutes. Presenters, we do have a time manager who is going to be telling you how much time you have, for your session. And allow me to invite Dr. Farouk from Nigeria to share the Nigerian experiences, and then we'll give each of the presenters, and then we'll come to the question and answer session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Farouk.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. Coincidentally, I have some slides, but because of the time constraint, I don't think I can go through the slides. So what I decided to do was to summarize the content of the slides and share the summary with you. In Nigeria, we have a purely defined contribution scheme, even though we have some few remnants of the defined benefit scheme, particularly those who are exempted by law from participating in the contributory pension scheme. And we introduced the reform in 2004. There were people who are already pensioners and people who are close to retirement. And the decision of the government was to exempt those who are 3 years away from retirement from participating in the contributory pension scheme, because they won't be able to save so much. And indeed, if you look at the transfer value from the defined benefit to the defined contribution, it will be some huge amount of money. And then there was need for people to clearly understand the new scheme. So this is just jumping into it. The decision was, okay, let's have at least some 3-year transition period. So we introduced a purely defined contribution scheme for both the public and private sector. Initially, only private sector institutions with at least 5 employees that were covered. But those with less than 5 employees were exempted from the scheme. Now, coincidentally, the scheme now includes the informal sector. This was part of the reforms that happened in 2014 when the 2014 Act was repealed and the 2014 Act was enacted. So, as I mentioned, there are still some defined benefit schemes in the public sector, and these schemes will run until the last pensioner on those schemes is no more. We set up an administrative structure. The structure is the scheme to be managed by 2 private institutions, the pension fund administrators and the pension fund custodians. The administrators are the ones that operate like banks. You go and open a pension account with any one of them that you choose that you like. We have about 19 of them at the moment. We license up to 26 plus over the years. But however, due to mergers and acquisition, changes in capital requirements, some of them could not could not cope with the requirements, so they merged or they were taken over. So we have 19 at the moment, and we have pension fund custodians. The custodians hold the assets. So the way it works is that you choose an administrator, you open a pension account with the administrator. However, when you contribute, or your employer contribute on your behalf, the money would go to the custodian, not to the administrator. So the administrator would choose a custodian. The custodians will license about 5, but 3 of them are currently working. So the money goes to the custodian, and then the custodian would then execute all transactions that are ordered by the administrator. So the administrator would take all the investment decisions and all other transactions, payments of retirement benefits when due, the custodian will execute. So we also have the closed pension fund administrators. These actually come from the legacy schemes that we know that were existing prior to the reforms in 2004. And because some of them were big, particularly the schemes run by the oil majors, so we asked them, if you need to continue with the schemes, you can actually keep them, but you have to register a subsidiary. And the subsidiary will now apply for license from the National Pension Commission to operate as a closed pension fund administrator that will serve only the staff of these institutions. So we had about 6 of them. We have 5 at the moment. One of them had withdrawn from the business. So we still also have some existing schemes that were approved, but that are being managed by the open pension fund administrators. And these schemes were basically employer-based. Employers, if they would want to give their employees, when they retire, some additional income, that particular scheme has to be approved by the National Pension Commission, and then the management of the scheme is going to be contracted to the pension fund administrators. So over these years, we have been able to accumulate a lot of money. We started in 2004 at ground zero. By August this year, we accumulated up to 17.3 trillion Nigerian naira. Indeed, as we shall see later, the effect of inflation has been eroding the value of this money. And we operate 6 different funds, Fund 1 to Fund 6. Fund 2 is the default fund. Fund 1, you go from Fund 2 on request. Fund 3 are for those who are above 50 years, people close to retirement. Fund 4 is strictly for retirees. Fund 5 is the macro pension fund. We shall probably talk about that later. We introduced the macro pension scheme in 2019. And so Fund 5 is strictly the fund for those under the macro pension plan. And then lastly, Fund 6, which is a non-ethical fund. Nigeria introduced the non-interest finance, and because of the large Muslim population in the country, there are a lot of people who would want their monies invested in this fund. So we created the Fund 6 to Qatar for those who are interested, and you go to Fund 6 also on request. And basically, most of these assets were investments in federal government securities, about 68% as of the end of August. We had some equities, about 9.3%, corporate debt, 10.7%, money market instruments, about 9.5%, and the rest are really very small investments. So you can see that there is a lot of growth from 0 to 17.3 trillion naira. And this is really, in Nigerian context, very, very huge amount of money. And this makes the pension funds the largest indigenous pool of funds, actually the largest pool of funds in Nigeria at the pension funds. And this growth actually is basically what you see across the African continent. The issue about Africa, though, because what I'm talking about is leveraging on pension funds for economic development. What role should supervisors play. And so indeed, when you look at Africa, largely you find weak infrastructure, low skills. We have a lot of dependencies on natural resources. However, the output is always subsistence output, so we need to do a lot more to develop the economy. And when you look at what we have discussed regarding the asset allocation on the Nigerian case, which is also the same thing, when I looked at some 7 other African countries, is that we are actually diversifying, trying to support economic development, particularly infrastructure. When you look at regulation generally, the regulation is basically to ensure that there is equity, there is protection to the consumer, to the environment, and indeed ensure that everything that is done within a particular market, within a particular economic segment, is done in the best interest of these two particular consumers that I mentioned. But in pensions, there is an additional issue, because you are looking at the contributors to ensure the safety of their contributions. You are also looking at how do you generate fair returns on investment, and indeed, you are looking at the possibility of paying the retirement benefits as and when due. Now, when you look at these responsibilities, then there is a lot to be done by the pension regulators across Africa in channeling the pension funds towards economic development, largely because we do not regulate other sectors. And if you are going into infrastructure, some other regulators are there to provide the necessary support, to provide the rules, ensure equity, ensure issues like environment protection, social security, social balance, and so on. I was told that I have just 5 minutes, so it's difficult to keep with the time. But as I was saying, I mean, the pension funds, the pool of funds that have been generated, actually provide a lot of opportunities for development in infrastructure. If we look at the Nigerian case, we've already invested over 400 million US dollars in infrastructure bonds, and particularly in road construction through the SCOOC. The SCOOC is a bond, but this is more of the non-interest version of bonds. And normally it has to be backed by an asset, and the assets that are being backed in Nigeria at the moment are largely the construction of roads. We have already built 4 private power plants and also 1,200 rooms of student hostels in one of the universities in south part of the country. We have invested in housing through rates, invested in bonds issued by mortgage companies, particularly the Federal Mortgage Bank, and indeed a lot of banks are raising funds through issuance of instruments for pension funds to invest in. But there are a lot of challenges. The pension funds are not really silver bullets. Developments depend on financial sector development in any particular sector of this, of the world. When you look at Africa, our challenges are many: limited investable instruments, inflation. When I look at inflation in Nigeria, as I said before, May this year, the pension assets, when valued in US dollars, were about 36 billion. But because of the policy of government to bridge the difference between parallel market and the central bank rates of foreign exchange, that then created a big issue because the value of the dollar jumped from 440 to an era by May this year to, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, over 1,000 naira. So this has reduced the value of the pension assets from the 36 billion, as I said, to just close to 23 billion US dollars. So there is limited capacity and technical skills. The quality of public institutions and the rule of law are also a lot of issues, because, I mean, if you want to have, you know, a very good and effective way of channeling pension funds into infrastructure and other economic sectors of, you know, of the continent, then definitely we have to have an effective legislation and so much strong and effective judicial system, particularly when you look at issues of people having problems. They need at least a judicial system that they can be confident in, that when they go, they know that they will get justice. This is basically one of the best ways you can attract foreign direct investments that will complement the, I mean, whatever the pension funds are going to provide. So regulators, we need to do so much, particularly push for portfolio reviews to accommodate new instruments. We need to be, particularly in this respect, perhaps use some sandboxes that will learn from and then improve, and then see how best we can come up with permanent policies around a particular, intervention in the economy. We need to be able to identify areas that inhibit cooperation between us, regulators in the pension industry, and regulators in other sectors, because we are consumers of these instruments. And unless these instruments are available, there's no way we will be able to actually effectively channel the pension funds. We can only use whatever is available. Indeed, in this aspect, I would like to say one issue that we tried to do in Nigeria, but actually didn't take place due to some political changes. You know, last administration left in May. Perhaps we'll be able to track it. The National Economic Council in Nigeria, which is the council of governors of the 36 states of the country, chaired by the vice president, decided to say, let's use the pension funds for infrastructure development. And because we have made provision in the regulations for up to 25% of the pension assets to be invested in infrastructure through bonds and funds, we worked actually, you know, very, we came up with a very good way of, you know, identifying particularly roads, railways, and power infrastructure that we could actually channel this 25% of the pension assets into effectively. And we felt that we should come up with a fund, which we did, the Nigeria Infrastructure Investment Fund, to be managed by the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, which is a subsidiary, well, just an agency under the Federal Ministry of Finance. And we came up with a fantastic, really, arrangement that we could issue bonds which are going to be guaranteed by government. We are telling the government, well, you can do this, you can go and borrow money, or you issue guarantee and ensure that everybody plays by the rules. Then you don't need to, you don't need to invest anything. You don't need to borrow and acquire a lot of charges. But the pension funds can actually do it, but just guarantee the principal amount and the revenue. And indeed, really, that would have been very, very transformative, because our thinking on railways, that would have covered about 26 states of the 36 of the country, because we had this narrow gauge that has been abandoned. We're thinking just go and refurbish that and get the wagons on. So I feel there is so much that pension funds can do in terms of supporting development in Africa. I don't have too much time. I hope I will have the opportunity to explain more during question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farouk. Allow me now to call on stage Mr. Prakash Seewoosunkur. Prakash?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I believe I have a PowerPoint slide. So, good afternoon. So I will briefly talk about the Mauritian experience on pension and the recent changes and implication for the FSC as a regulator in supervising pension. So here is a slide, is a snapshot of the pension landscape in Mauritius. So you have the pillar 0, the basic retirement pensions. You have the pillar 1, which is like the National Pension Fund, where you can see it is discontinued. So I'll come back to that. And then we have the pillar 3, which that the FSC oversees. So going back to our past speaker, when he was speaking about pensions, like investment made by pensions, if you come to Mauritius, I think we had our last, some years back in 2020, in-person meeting in Mauritius for the Iops. If you go to Port Louis, the capital city, for those who can relate to it, there's an NPF building there. So the name comes from this pension scheme. If you go to Rosil, there's another NPF building. So if you go to Eben, there's another NPF building. So NPF was also investing on banks, but now when I'm speaking today, this pension has gone, it's disappeared. So I'll tell you why, what happened in a second. So more recently, what happened is that traditionally, just wanted to say like traditionally, pension in Mauritius was something you do not think of. If you have a job, then you expect that you would get a pension. So if you have a permanent job in any company in Mauritius, the expectation was, okay, when I retire, I would get a pension, and I don't need to worry about that. But you know now this assumption has gone, and people need to be aware about pension. But this thinking that you don't need to worry about pension is a major issue, and this causes a lot of issues, and this is where a number of changes has been brought to our legislation. So the first legislation was like, in 2020, we brought a change, and we introduced a new animal in the landscape. It's called the Portable Retirement PRGF, okay? It's a fund that is there it provides payment for gratuity to workers on his retirement or to the legal heirs of a worker on the death of the worker. Every employer is required to pay PRGF contribution at the rate of 4.5% of the monthly remuneration. An employer who is exempted from contributing to the PRGF if he sponsors a private pension scheme. So this means that you have a private pension scheme, or if you don't have one, you have to go and contribute to the government. So this is kind of because in the past, pension scheme is voluntary. The second pillar has merged, like the NPF has merged with technically speaking, with a basic salary, basic pension scheme. And now we have a PRGF that has come and is competing with a occupational private pension scheme. That was announced. And this shows that people trust on pension schemes has gone down for many reasons, which I'll come later on discuss about it. Then what has happened also is that we have tax. So I think Pablo was saying that pension works with tax incentives. That doesn't work in Mauritius. In Mauritius, you don't get any tax incentives for your contribution you make to your occupational pension scheme. And we have been fighting for many, many years. And then recently, I think only last year, Trisha, that we are 2 years back, that contribution to the personal pension scheme. It's not occupational, the personal pension scheme. You get a tax exemption for about 1,000 euros per year. And that means like if I go to an insurance company, I buy a pension plan from that insurance company, then I get that tax exemption. So it means that you have the occupational pension scheme, you have PRGF, now you have the private pension scheme. 3 animals in one zoo. So just imagine what could happen. So then what is happening is also the basic retirement pension for each citizen has been increased, okay? from 60, okay? As from 60, so 235 euros. We have now a social contribution, CSG, which was established in 2020. It pays a monthly allowance of 43 euros for those earning 530 euros per month. So now it's kind of a positive payment. So instead of paying government pays to use through the CSG some additional revenues for different categories of employees. So you get 21 euros for those earning 530 euros to 1,060 euros. And then we have also had a change in the formula of computing the gratuity in terms of, instead of 15 by 22, now it's like 15 by 26, means that there's a slight reduction in the amount you would receive. Okay, and now I'm just trying to be mindful of time, going directly to some slide. So in terms of statistics, we have, in terms of historically, we had only DB schemes. So the DB schemes, the way it was working in Mauritius, like, as I said, you get a job, you don't worry about pension. Your employer or the government contributes 100% to your pension, okay? And then when you retire, you would get a very beautiful pension benefit. But that is not the case. Even for government employees, you have to contribute about 6%, and government would contribute about 12%. So it's about 18% for those in the government sector. When it comes to private sector, the contribution is, in some pension schemes, it's still 100% by the private companies. But the private companies are not happy about that, and I'll tell you why. So in terms of DB schemes, you would find that the number of funds in DB, which is not purely DB now, so some of them is 21 for pure DB, hybrid 19, and then we have 36 defined contribution. So when I was discussing with some of you, I was saying like we should protect DB, and the statistics is saying in Mauritius, the DC schemes have more money than DB schemes, okay? So this is because traditionally, only big corporates, government are putting money in DB schemes, whereas gradually, for many small entities, it is only the DC schemes. And even in government now, everyone is having DC schemes. So those joining after 2012, I think they have to go for a DC scheme in government as well. So we have officially moved to DC scheme, but we still maintain a lot of DB schemes in our portfolio. And in terms of number of members that it is under our mandate, so 25% of the working populations are under either these DB or DC schemes. Okay, and then what I want to say. Yeah, so the current trend is, like I said, to move from DB to DC scheme. So what is happening in Mauritius is like mortality rate have steadily declined over the past century, which have translated into a large increase in life expectancy. So the Mauritian population, there is very few births, but the population is remaining constant. So it means that people are living longer. Pension benefits and healthcare benefits, which are all, like healthcare is free in Mauritius, education is free, transport for all age person is free. So a lot of free things people get in Mauritius. So because of politics, obviously. And then we need to get money for that. So this means that it's translated a higher cost for pension schemes and government. The growing financial difficulties. So what happened with COVID is that COVID brought down our biggest, like our national airline. So our national airline was a DB scheme. So far, as a regulator, we had not changed. We have tried to protect the DB schemes. But then the national airline, when it went down, we had to do some drastic changes on what to do. So basically, there were many employees who were all on DB schemes, highly paid staff on DB schemes. So the liability means it was poorly funded, like most DB schemes, with the utilities. So most of the DB schemes are poorly funded. So we had to agree on how to convert these DB schemes to DC schemes. So following our last Iops meeting, which was held in Mauritius in 2020, where we discussed with some of you about what to do, how to move from DB to DC, that's where IOPS is very interesting, because you can learn from others and try to adapt your strategy. So we came up with a guideline on how to deal with DB schemes and how to convert to DC. So we came up with two options. One was a conversion, and which means that it's a process where converting the members' benefits in a DB scheme that have accrued up to the date of conversion and crediting the commuted value to the members' individual accounts. So basically what it means, like, it's a portability. You take the DB schemes, you put it in your DC scheme. The beauty of it is that you get a big pot, and that big pot can bring you more revenue. So if I have a 10,000 euros accumulated, I bring in my DC, if DC is doing 5%, I get a bigger amount to do it. But what is happening is that we had also provided a shift following discussion, very difficult discussion with industry, which is a shift, which means that we stop the DB schemes with whatever is outstanding there, whatever deficit is there, and we say, okay, we'll deal with that when you retire. And then we are shifting you to the DC scheme. And this is what's happening with the national airline, where we said there's a huge deficit in the pension, you move there, and then we'll see how to fund the DB schemes. So it means that the benefit is frozen, so you can't take the money. Then when you start a DC scheme, you're starting very low. So you would start the first month with your first premium. So how much revenue you would get? So it's a small amount, small percentage, you get small. The other amounts that you have accumulated, you don't know even if you're going to get it because it's in a DB scheme which is gone bust. Okay? So this is practically most of the cases that our pension team and I also were dealing, because most of the DB pension scheme. And for the employers, what they are saying now, it's a liability for them. And they want to get rid of the liability. So the way they want to get rid of the liability, instead of putting money, they try to find ways to say that, okay, that liability for accrued benefits is lower. And because of the assumptions, everyone says, like, when you discuss with them, it keeps on fluctuating. And then this is also where people are not so well educated about what is the role, what is the trustee's role, what is the role of the employer, of the administrator, because traditionally the employer is the one that's owning the pension scheme. So they were employing, also engaging the administrator, the investor, the investment company. So instead of dealing with the trustees, people deal with the employer. So when the employer has an interest in not putting money, because the more money they put, and following COVID, they get a good excuse. It's a wonderful excuse to say that, okay, we don't have enough money, I go bust, all these people would lose money. So government tells us, okay, we need to be a little bit more flexible. So even we don't receive contribution, so we have to live with it. Okay, so that's where we are. Okay, so that's explained on the conversion, the shift. So the statistics into the conversion where we have reached is that shift completed 8, 10 is work in progress, conversion is 3, and work in progress is 16. Now, what is the difference between the personal pension scheme and the PRGF? So what is happening is that, this is where I was saying that educating people about pension is very important. Now, in Mauritius, what is happening is that there are workers that, in the past, people were working with one company. Now, if you are a laborer, if you are a worker, you work with one company for 10 years, then the company goes bust, you go to work for another company, and what happened to your money that you have contributed for 10 years? It disappears. Disappears means it's still there, but people don't know where it is, where to go find it. So people like these unions went to say to governments that we want a scheme that's going to protect them. So they come up with a PRGF, and there you put your money. But the problem is, with that, when people feel that if I give money to the government, it's safer than if I give it to the private sector. So pension scheme is private, PRGF is government. You put your money, so what is happening also is that those who are having pension schemes, they were playing a trick with us. They were saying that instead of contributing, as I said, you have to contribute 6% plus 12, 18% to get a good DC scheme or good DB scheme. These people were contributed only 3% in a personal pension scheme. 3% from the employees, 3% from the employers. It's a 6%. So it was creating a moral hazard in the sense that giving people the false assurance that they can have a pension with 6%. And with a poor interest rate return, and with high fees for administrators and investment advisors. So practically, you're subsidizing those administrators. So government said, okay, we come up with PRGF. So when government came with PRGF, it was 4.5. Then it had to legislate to make the pension scheme know that it is minimum 4.5% you have to put, else your pension scheme is not going to be valid. Now, they get a tax rebate on pension scheme. If they have a pension scheme, all contributions made to those pension schemes are exempt from tax. Okay, so now, if you are an employee, what would you choose? Your employer say, okay, I want you to go in the pension scheme, or you want to go as a portable. For low-income earners, they say, I want to go in a PRGF, because once I get 60, I'll get a full lump sum. If you put money in a pension scheme, you don't know what is happening. So some of the pension schemes don't even give benefit statements, so you don't know where you are. Whereas for someone who is a worker who is not well educated, for him, he knows, I put 1,000 rupees this year, so I have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. He knows where he is, okay? And he knows that the record is kept by the government. With a private pension scheme, we have loads of money for people, laborers who have worked very hard in private companies, and because they change address, people don't know where to go. But as you know, there is a national central database for a population where people can know where people are, so there is a way of finding it. So that's the difference between the PRGF and PS pension scheme. Now, in terms of disclosures, so this is what we believe is very important. So our strategy has been to make people aware through transparency what is the state of affairs. Because in the past, employers were kind of, saying to them, don't worry about it, it's under control. So now we are saying, no. Beneficiaries need to know whether the employers are telling them the truth, whether they are paying their premium, whether they're contributing, and whether the income that they're supposed to get at retirement is sufficient for them to be able to decide. And now we see many trustees who come and ask us, look, we're having this problem with this administrator, we're having this problem with pension scheme, we're not getting benefit statement. So we have, as a regulator, tried to use the tools that we have, which means that benefit statements, transparency, role of trustees, try to influence the system to make them understand that your job is to ensure that you are working in the best interest of the employees, of the beneficiaries. You are not working for the employers, and the money in the pension scheme belongs to the beneficiaries and members. So that's basically how we have addressed the whole issue of DB to DC scheme. I've tried to make it quite condensed, so I'll be very glad to take any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Prakash, and well done to my timekeeper. You're doing an excellent job. Allow me now to call Gandy, Gandidzanwa, to share the local experience and also the Southern African experience. Gandy.
The fear of every speaker, other than the fear of the stage itself, especially when you are the last speaker, is that by the time you go to the stage, all the brilliant ideas would have been already shared. It's not only a fear for me right now, it is the reality. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Let's get going. So I'm going to talk to you just on a couple of slides. If I can move this thing. Okay, there we go. Okay. Probably I should have called that more the content as opposed to the agenda. My apologies for that. So when I was asked to speak on this topic, the question that comes to my mind was, to what extent can one speak about challenges of DC funds in Africa before they speak about the challenges of DC funds in general? And I know there has already been adequate justice that has been done with respect to the challenges of DC funds in general. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Suffice to say, though, that I'm going to kindly ask you to allow me to take a slightly different angle from the challenges and issues that have already been raised. I guess this is also more about me using this opportunity to speak about issues that I've always carried about DC funds, their flaws and weaknesses, and I had never had an opportunity to speak to regulators like I do have now. Thank you. The second issue then that I'm going to touch on is on Africa, the socio-economic dynamics, how then the issues having on DC funds then get to be compounded by the socio-economic dynamics of Africa. From there on, I'm going to spend some bit of time talking to you about capital markets and asking the very important question whether or not African capital markets do pose challenges or opportunities for the pension fund industry. From there on, I'm going to just, on a slide or two, talk to you about the industry design and practice issues, and then I'll move on to what I want to propose as solutions, and obviously take my seat back as I await your questions. Thank you. Okay. All right. So this has been grappling and preoccupying me for quite some time now in terms of the conversion that we witnessed a couple of decades ago, depending on from which part of the world you are, from DBs to DCs. And that started from realizing that there seems to be more challenges and issues with DC funds than we had with DB funds. Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever imagined, and can you imagine now, that what if somebody were to just walk through this door and say to all of us here, you know what, the structure that you are using for DC funds is wrong. Why do I ask that? Because at times I'm made to believe so. DBs aren't DCs. While the end objective is the same, the path to getting there is totally different. And yet, in terms of the legal structure that currently houses DC funds is exactly the same as it was under DB funds. Shouldn't we have paused at the time of conversion en masse from DB funds to DC funds to just ask ourselves the question, is the legal structure going to do justice to the new system? The other question to be asked, ladies and gentlemen, is around the contributions that we're making. Are we not expecting too much from the contributions that we are making, which in most instances would be close to about 60%, 70% of the total contributions that were being paid under DB funds, that then we are expecting that lower level of contributions to still deliver the same kind of results that would have obtained under a DB fund. Whatever heavy lifting in terms of contributions, in terms of investments that we're expecting that contributions to make is quite huge. Probably to an extent where the bulk of it should actually be sitting in cryptocurrency, depending, of course, on what period that you're looking at. The other question that I have around DC funds is still on contributions, is the question around whose money is it anyway? And there is this sense and notion of an overly adopted employer paternalism mindset. And with time, I'm going to spend some time on that. But where my point of departure is really around giving power to members and let them vote with their feet. And I'll explain soon what I mean by that. The trustee structure that we currently houses DC funds, at some point I've been made to ask myself, wouldn't a common structure deliver better results? Why do I say so? It would give more innovation. It will bring with it more innovation. It will probably be more cost effective. It will probably be more member-centric. Competition will drive weaklings out, and it will also probably come with less regulation. Some would argue that probably it would come with more, but I beg to differ. Mistrust between employer and employee would then is irrelevant because this is DC, right? If one looks quite closely with the DC arrangement, the reason why it's so much different from the DB arrangement is who is carrying the bulk of the risks. Under a DB, it was the employer. Then maybe one could argue that there was that much need for employer involvement. Under a DC, as we all know, it is the member, and the question is, how much power have we passed on to members as we converted from DBs to DCs? Focus on accumulation at retirement as opposed to income in retirement, quite another huge flaw and weakness of the DC arrangement. No wonder why we easily talk about the member pot, bring this mindset of accumulating to a point in time, which is obviously quite contradictory to what the core objective of any retirement savings should be, which is actually retirement, income in retirement. DC funds never intended to be the primary platform for retirement savings, and there is an interesting history to that, and it goes back to around 1979 when a financial planner in the US stumbled upon an act in one of their tax acts that then spoke to, it was actually a flaw in the act, and from there on, they then created the DC fund, or at least the DC fund as we know it today has got a lot of linkages to that. With that said, and I just wanted to really set the tone for that. And so as we look at the African problems, obviously there are dynamics of Africa that then compound the issues of the DC regime as a system for housing, retirement savings. But let's just quickly take a look at the specifics around the Africa socio-economic dynamics. The one huge problem that we have, and I'm glad when from the previous speakers, it also does appear that it's a problem that's shared globally, but it is around members being totally disengaged for most of the time, or being overly engaged for the wrong reasons. Overly engaged when they are resigning because they want to access their member pot, or overly engaged just before retirement, at which point in time it will be way, way too late. It's probably time that we really, to bring this change of behavior among its members, that we start looking at behavioral biases and human psychology for guidance in terms of how we can then address these challenges of member disengagement or overly engagement at the most wrong time. Immediate benefits considered more important, and this is a huge challenge in Africa. So you've got a member who is struggling right now to pay school fees. He's struggling to buy their put years under a roof, and you're talking to them about a benefit that is only going to accrue in about 40 years' time. What do you think that member is going to do? They're going to focus more on the immediate needs. The solution to that, as I would want to propose, would be probably around incorporating as many immediate benefits as is possible. I'm glad that a colleague of mine from South Africa did mention that South Africa is now introducing the two-pot system, which in my view goes quite far in addressing that. Not only does it give members immediate access to some of their fund credits, but it also allows members to continually engage with their retirement savings. It sounds a bit unconventional that you are asking members to access part of their fund credits as a solution to actually encouraging them to grow more member fund credits for retirement. I also want to just highlight the point around that for Africa, retirement savings where they do exist for a particular member is probably the only asset that they would have other than their house, if not in the village. But certainly the only savings that they are most likely to have. I'm told I've got under 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cruise, but please just bear with me. Absence of Pillar 0 and Pillar 1 in Africa is quite a huge problem. Voluntary arrangements, again, another problem. So there is no conversion here for the establishment of private occupational schemes amongst many African countries. Absence of retirement savings regulatory framework for those in the informal sector. Again, a point that has been raised a few times. So just a quick one on capital markets. Obviously, the issue around a lack of deep capital markets. But then for some of us, we ask the question, is it a curse or a blessing for Africa? One could actually argue that maybe it is a blessing in the sense that this industry is quite a great opportunity to make huge changes in the fortunes of Africa by really then channeling the assets that sit under our jurisdiction to channel them towards changing the fortunes of the economies that we operate under. The other question to be asked around capital markets, especially in as far as you compare them with the capital markets of the developed world, would be around whether your traditional listed equities, your bonds and your property, which are the dominant traditional asset classes in the developed world, whether or not they are going to deliver the same kind of performance like we have seen in the past couple of decades, call it 6 decades, 7 decades. and in some instances 8 decades. There is a school of thought that argues that maybe those traditional assets are not going to deliver the same kind of performance. That then brings forth the question around, if we're not going to be investing in the traditional asset classes, where are we going to be investing? And the answer is obviously, as we would all agree, is in alternatives. And that's an area where Africa, if we could actually channel the assets that we have under our management, we could really make some meaningful contributions to the fortunes of our economies. And a related point around that would be, how then is the 40-60 split going to look like under a slightly different range of different asset classes, where one that is actually dominated by alternatives. So from a regulatory perspective, and I obviously look at things from a practitioner's perspective, but I think the cry that you would find from quite a number of other scholars who share the same kind of thinking is there is need for serious regulatory changes that then ramp up provisions for alternative allocations. Politics continue to lead economics in Africa. Inflationary environment, high unemployment, high and volatile exchange rates remain real problems for Africa. But if one actually looks very, very closely at the core of African problems, you find that it is really issues around foreign exchange, or they are foreign exchange related or foreign currency related problems. And one would argue that if the pension fund industry were to allocate more of its assets into the alternative space, earmarked for generation of foreign currency, that then the industry would have played quite a very important role in addressing some of the challenges that Africa has. So industry has got quite a strategic role to play in turning around the economic fortunes of Africa. I'm just going to take some 2 minutes or so of your time talking to you on the industry design and practice issues. The industry in Africa remains very much fragmented. We've got way too many small funds. You find in some jurisdictions we've got 5-member funds, 10-member funds, 100-member funds. That's way too small for any pension fund to be able to make any meaningful contribution towards its members, as they say, for retirement. But not only do we have way too many small funds, we also have got way too many service providers. So you find that one pension fund at any point in time has to be dealing with 6 or 7 different service providers. The question is, whatever it is that this industry provides should be so complex that it needs so many different service providers, where with each one of them there is a salary that needs to be paid for the MD and everyone else in between. Then there is also the issue around, and again, it speaks back to a point I made earlier on around the trust structure as the legal structure for housing and retirement savings, where you find, especially here in Africa, that your key decision makers, who are the trustees, they are not always that motivated towards meeting or serving the best interests of members. Not that they are anti-serving the best interests of members, but the incentives are just not there, the motivation is just not there. And for some of us, then it raises the question, wouldn't trustee remuneration be probably the solution to that? Not only does it financially incentivize the trustees, but it also would make members to hold them accountable. When you know that you are paying a trustee for a service to sit in those board meetings and make those important decisions, you are certainly going to follow up on whether or not they are doing that. Need for trustee intellectual empowerment is certainly a big issue in Africa. Commercialization of knowledge, however, by the industry is a threat. We have seen in some jurisdictions where every industry gathering that takes place is paid for by the trustees. The question is, what happened to free educational sessions for the industry by the industry practitioners? Lack of meaningful innovation and failure to adopt technology as an enabler, again, remains one of the big issues of pension fund management in Africa. So in terms of our solutions, or my proposed solutions, this is my last slide, and I'm going to not spend more than 2 minutes on it. So regulation enforced, so this is, in my view, the solutions boil down to about a 6-point kind of intervention. And it starts with regulation enforced industry-wide consolidation of the industry into commercial, public, or industry umbrella, or super funds, as they are called in Australia. We still use the term here, umbrella funds. It will then address all the issues around lack of economies of scale and a fragmented industry and a few other issues that I raised earlier on. Then related to that would be to open up fund membership to the members and not to centralize it via the employer. So I spoke earlier on about my views on employer paternalism and how I feel that, while it was that relevant over the DB regime, that is probably no longer relevant or that much relevant under a DC arrangement. But what would that do? It will also then create competition among service providers. So if you've got a super fund and a member can actually choose between different super funds, what you're effectively saying is you're saying to the industry that, look, there is now competition, the same way that banks compete, right? And there is this also notion that members would struggle with making the right decisions around their retirement savings. But these are the same members that we don't have problems with when they make decisions around which banks they want to use. These are the same members that we don't have problems with when they are making decisions around from which mortgage provider they would want to borrow. And yet suddenly when we start talking retirement savings, we bring in this whole notion around maybe the employer knows better and maybe the employer needs to guide them. We could be very wrong. Consideration for conversion of fund membership for the workforce to generate industry-wide economies of scale. So the one thing that obviously quite a number of African countries do not have is the element of conversion. And they've always wondered, and hopefully now that I have this opportunity to be addressing this question to the regulators, you will help me understand why in some jurisdictions conversion is not the right thing to do or the way to go. Focus on mass customization and mass distribution, leveraging on technology as an enabler. To me, again, we are living in 2023, and one of the weaknesses and flaws of the financial services industry in general, when compared to other industries, is that we have always been kind of behind when it comes to full adoption of technology. Yes, we have done very, very well, but relatively, when you look at other industries and other sectors, you realize that maybe the financial services industry is lagging behind. But that's probably more so for the pension fund industry, in particular as a subsector of the financial services industry. Repeal and replace trust-based laws with corporate company-based laws or something similar, again, based on the arguments that I made earlier on around whether or not, we are continuing to house members' retirement savings under the appropriate legal structure. Ramp up regulatory provisions for allocations to alternatives. Certainly, one thing that I believe would be quite a huge contributor to turning around the fortunes of the African economies. But not only that, it is believed by many scholars that going into the future, your traditional listed stocks are not going to generate as much in terms of performance as your alternatives. That in fact, your alternatives is going to become the new norm. That's basically from it and from my side. But I would also just want to share with you some words of wisdom that I felt, at times we just need to remind ourselves on. He said, and this is Franklin Roosevelt, more than 40 years ago, it was true then, and it remains true now. No greater tragedy exists in modern civilization than the aged wake-out worker, who after a life of ceaseless effort and useful productivity must look forward to his declining years to a poorhouse. A modern social consciousness demands a more human and efficient arrangement. And I challenge all of us here to keep thinking about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gandy. Good timing. I was just about to come and read the Riot Act, but you managed well. So friends, we have about 40 minutes, I think, for the panelists to entertain some questions. I think we have the roving mics. Ladies, if we can have some questions, we are ready to take questions. You can direct them to a particular panelist. Yes. Okay. I think we've been advised, just introduce yourself and as you post your question.
I'm from Botswana, just next door. My question is to all of us, actually. Indeed, I do agree that pension is... Indeed, I do agree that pension is meant to avoid poverty during old age. But of late, especially in my country, we've been experiencing a situation where people have lost their jobs and they are losing their houses because the financial institutions are foreclosing them. And the politicians and everybody else is saying, you pension people are actually spiraling poverty because if you have had, let me give you an example, a mortgage of 1.2 million, you have paid 800, you are now unemployed, and you lose the house. You are actually going to end up being more poor than you would otherwise have been. And there is this drive to say, save the people's houses. And that would mean very substantial withdrawals from pension funds if we were to go that route. And I would just like to understand from the panelists and all of us around here what can really be done, because sometimes you really feel it when somebody comes to your office, is crying and the house is being foreclosed. Thank you.
Yes, Gandy will attempt, but anyone else, I think this is a question to all of us as regulators. And there are practitioners here as well. You also want to contribute? Okay. Okay, Gandy, I'll come to you. Dr. Darius?
Thank you. Darius Stanke from the OECD, from the Iops Secretariat. I was looking at the presentation by Dr. Farouk, and if I properly remember, there was like 15% for regulation now allowing investment in the infrastructure. And that sounds very nice, but in the other presentation, I have this privilege to see the other presentations that were not presented yet. It seems that actual use of this ceiling is very, very low, so you don't have the projects. And on the other hand, in Nigeria, you said 60%, roughly speaking, is invested in the government bonds, which is very similar to the Central European model, which is very, very similar to the Nigerian model. So my question is, of course, one question is how to get the new investment opportunities. Of course, the answer might be to create the local markets and so on, so forth. And we see the efforts, especially in some of African countries, to create the alternatives market. But in the meantime, maybe you could consider investing abroad. And so this is the question, because basically with 60% or 70% allocated in the bonds, this is not a funded system. It's a pay-as-you-go in disguise, basically. So that's the first question. And the second question, I was thinking in terms of using the pension funds assets for the economic development. We are here, most of us, not me, but most of you are the regulators. Do you have any reflections about how to combine the benefits of the country or the region that this needs to be developed with the protection of the members' best interest? Because sometimes those two goals might not really work well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darius. Let me ask Gandy if you can respond to the first question, and then I'll ask Dr. Farouk to respond to that. I think if I heard you clearly, how do we balance between investment returns and economic development? Yeah, so how do we strike that balance? Good returns for pensioners and economic development. So I'll ask Dr. Farouk to take that.
If my interpretation of the question is correct, then it speaks to issues around pension-backed home loans. I'm not sure if the Botswana regulation and legislation does provide for that, but in some jurisdictions it has actually become quite a common and very popular provision in the Act. So maybe it is a conversation that we could have, but yeah, certainly pension funds could actually play quite a huge role in terms of keeping homeowners in their homes through borrowing from their fund credits. Thank you.
Prakash, any views on that?
Yes, just to share with you that we had a major crisis. So I'm talking about two major crises. One was the closure of the biggest insurance company, where people lost a lot of money, and still we are having the aftershock of it. And then we had the COVID. So we did get requests from many members whether they can take money from out of the pension scheme to deal with those urgent needs that must arise. For example, when the insurance company went bust, many people had their kids studying abroad, so they did not have enough money, so they wanted to get the money. However, our rules did not allow us to give them the money, but we do understand that this is one area where we need to maybe work to change so that it makes the pension scheme a kind of a safe haven for when things go bad. So basically, I think in Australia you can retrieve, I remembered when we were discussing, so in Mauritius it's not allowed, but I think going forward we should think about how we can, when there is such dire situation, people can retrieve the money. And there was one person I remember, because we got a complaint, that he had to go for a medical, intervention, life-threatening, and he was saying like, okay, I want to get my pension money. People saying, no, you can't get the pension money because you're not. It was very scary, but they say like, if he was dead, he would have got the pension money. Basically, this is how bad it was. So yes, this is something that needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that's helpful. Yeah, but lots of thank you. Let me ask Dr. Farouk to respond to the balance. Yes.
When you look at the portfolio, when we started in 2004, we allowed 100% of the contributions to be invested in federal government securities. However, as we move, and we gain experience and knowledge, we started to reduce the amount of money that can be invested in federal government securities. And we have reviewed the investment regulation 4 times between 2006 and today. And indeed, we're working towards coming up with a guideline on offshore investment. Actually, it has been drafted. It has been with the Central Bank of Nigeria because of the issues of foreign exchange. Our people were thinking we need to get the foreign exchange from government. And I've been arguing personally that, in my personal opinion, that's not the best way to go. Let's have a more sustainable way of getting foreign exchange for the pension fund. So can we have an innovative way of getting foreign exchange? So yes, we want to go offshore, not only to protect the value of the pension assets, but also as an avenue to get actually more money. Because what I can see, we can create a kind of cyclic situation where we invest the money outside, and then when we bring it back, actually it's going to be big. So we have more money that we can actually use for infrastructure development. For example, as I mentioned, beginning of this year is 400 naira to $1. When I left, it's about 950 naira. In fact, it crossed the 1,000 naira mark to a dollar. If we had so much money outside the country, then we were able to repatriate that money back into the country and use it to actually develop the infrastructure. So yes, we are working towards that. People are becoming conscious, largely because on a monthly basis, people receive alerts on their mobile phones of whatever the value of the pension account is as at the end of that month. So people are really asking these hard questions. Why should my pension money be this big in naira, but then when I converted it to dollars, it's shrinking by the day. So that's why we are pushing for this offshore investment. But as I said, we are looking at not just protecting the value of the pension assets, but also as an opportunity to get bigger money back into the country for economic development. Now, when the issue we have is that, yes, we have about 25% allowance in the regulation for infrastructure investment, 15% through bonds. In fact, on some funds it's 20%, and then 5% through infrastructure funds. However, the trouble we have is the size of the economy, the structure of the economy, we're still really trying to have some sort of structure for the Nigerian economy. If you look at Africa in general, apart from South Africa and some few countries, really, if you look at the financial system, it's still really underdeveloped. In Nigeria, yes, it's the biggest economy in Africa, but really it's unstructured economy. I can remember when we came in 2005, the Commonwealth Secretariat had to intervene to help us actually organize a sort of conference workshop on how to develop the PE in Nigeria, private equities. We had some funds, but really they're nowhere. We look at the capital market, it's just about 166 listings. So it's still too low. And then you have some of the big companies really unlisted. Sometimes I said to myself, do I become more social and see how we can get a policy from government, just like the Mandela style, black empowerment after, after apartheid. Get these companies. I mean, you have oil majors that are lifting oil from Nigeria, but they're not listed on the Nigerian market. They're listed elsewhere. So there are a lot of these issues. So when you look at getting good returns, the trouble is the financial system itself is not strong enough to help, to allow us to do this. And I believe that doing foreign investment is one way, but I don't think it's the best way, the only way or the best way to solve the problem. We need to really work on the economy as a whole. My happiness is that about 10 years ago, we came up with this idea of financial system, financial regulation coordinating steering committee, where all the financial regulators work together. The Central Bank, National Pension Commission, the Insurance Commission, the Deposit Insurance Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and some ministries of finance, education, and so on. We work together as a team. And coincidentally, we have been trying to drive so many initiatives through this platform. And I believe that, working together, putting our heads, we have been able to do so much, and we are trying to achieve so much as well. So it's really about pushing, doing more with the economy, really, than just foreign investment.
Thank you, Dr. Farouk. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, I think over there. And I was just thinking also, Dr. Pablo, maybe you can reflect, I think, on the question from Botswana, how, if OECD, you've got any guidance and how you've dealt with partial access to retirement savings. Yeah, I know that Australia did something. Maybe you could share some views on that as well. But we'll take the question there, and then they'll bring the mic to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Mvula Elia from Zambia, Pensions and Insurance Authority. For Mauritius, I heard that DC scheme members are able to make investment choices. So I just want to find out how much of that membership, in terms of percentages, if you have exercised that right, or is it that the majority simply choose the default category of investment? Then for Zimbabwe, I heard that there is no compulsory or mandatory joining to the scheme, and that is true for most of the schemes in Africa. But then I'm thinking that for US, Ali, I think he mentioned that they are trying to move to mandatory joining. So do you think that that is the route maybe the African schemes should also be undertaking? Then lastly, for Nigeria, I heard that pension funds invest in real estate, and that can be direct or indirect. So I'm interested in indirect investment in terms of shares. Do you have a specific valuer for those property shares? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's take them in that order. We start with Prakash, we go to Gandy, and then we will come to Dr. Farouk. Thank you.
Yes, so if I understand your questions about the choices of employees in terms of investment. So just let me clarify one point is that employees cannot choose their pension schemes. They cannot choose, so if the employer has put up a DB scheme, so they would have to join that DB scheme, but technically all the new DB schemes are closed, so they would have to join a DC scheme. Now, when on joining a DC scheme, you have different investment plans. So basically, and they would give you some paperwork to show what's the performance, and you have to choose. So once you choose that pot in which you want to invest, that would remain there, and you can change it over time, you're allowed to do, but there might be some additional costs depending on the rules of each pension scheme. So some people want to very actively change from one pot to another pot or one fund to another fund, but then there are some charges, obviously, that is associated. But it is quite flexible in the DC scheme. I hope I've covered all your questions.
Thank you. So there are two levels of compulsion that one can make reference to. I only spoke on one and not the other. The one that I spoke about is the compulsion for all employers to establish an occupational scheme of some sort for their employees. That's what we don't have in Zimbabwe. What we do have is, as a condition of your contract of employment, if your employer does sponsor a retirement savings platform of some sort, you are automatically, as part of your conditions of employment, required to be a member of that fund.
But also, we do have a compulsory national social security scheme. Okay, so that's our pillar one. So that exists. Thank you. Dr. Farouk?
Okay, the pension scheme is compulsory in the public sector. And then for the private sector, initially it was, as I mentioned during my talk, is for those with at least 5 employees, they must participate. So it's mandatory for them. Now, the Pension Reform Act 2014 made it mandatory for even less now. Those with at least 3 employees, they must participate in the pension scheme. However, when we look at Nigeria, is huge with very small formal sector. Total population was estimated about 212 million. But when you look at the formal sector, both public and private, is less than 10 million. So when you look at the adult population, is about 100 million. That means over 90 million are actually working in the informal sector. So it's really difficult because now you are trying to extend coverage and you are covering, largely the informal sector. But that's why we introduced a macro pension scheme, and we're doing what we're doing to ensure that we get as many of them as possible. Now, on the issue of the shares of real estate, yes, I mentioned that we can do in bonds and funds. So you can invest in funds, and then you can invest in bonds. It's easy for the bonds in terms of valuation, but in terms of the funds, we don't do the valuation ourselves, but the issuers do the valuation, but then we have standards. We have clearly outlined what standards that are required, and so in reviewing, we just ensure that those standards are strictly adhered to. So really, we don't keep valuation, and we don't do valuations ourselves. It's done by them, but it's reviewed. And coincidentally, apart from, for most of the investments of the pension funds, we review on daily basis. We have a department, investment supervision department, that does that. Whatever they did yesterday, it must be in to us by today before 5 o'clock. And by Friday, the transactions of Friday, we must receive before 5 o'clock on Monday. But issues like real estate, we don't do them on daily basis, is normally on periodic basis, quarterly, 6 months, and end of year. That's how it is done. Thank you.
Dr. Pablo?
Hi. If I understand, the question is about early access to retirement savings. In the recommendations that we have at the OECD that I presented in the previous session, we have included this early access to retirement savings because this was one of the key experiences that countries reported during the COVID pandemic. And the recommendation is early access should be a measure of last resort, and it should be based on personal circumstances. Before, they were talking about very specific personal circumstances. This is the message of the OECD, but also we learn from the implementation in many countries. Some countries, they have, before COVID-19, legislated how access to retirement savings could be done before. One country that have that and it worked very well was Mexico. Other countries didn't have that. And during the COVID period, they tried to legislate in the moment of crisis. And as we know, in terms of policy, this is not a good idea. When we compare it, a country like Mexico that suffered COVID as much as many other countries, because they have legislated the reasons why people could access early in dire, and it was based on personal circumstances, dire circumstances, there were withdrawals. But compared with the countries that suddenly legislated on the COVID, their withdrawals was very small because it was focused on only the people that really needed them. Not suddenly everybody had access. So it's very important that, yes, it's a measure of last resort based on personal circumstances, and it should be legislated, not suddenly there is a crisis and then. And it should be very clear in the legislation what is the access. Obviously, different countries will have different personal circumstances. One last thing, it sounded to me, maybe I'm wrong, that when some people was talking about auto-enrollment, it sounded like it was a mandatory system. Auto-enrollment is not a mandatory system. Individuals have the option to opt out. So it's not mandatory in that sense, just to clarify. From the point of view of the individual, it is not. In the US, in the UK, every country that has implemented auto-enrollment, the individuals have the option to opt out. So in the way we define it in the OECD, this is not a mandatory arrangement. Thank you.
We can give it another 10 minutes so we can deal with the questions. I think that should be fine. That's why we are here. So we can allow the last 3 questions. So we'll take that one at the end, and certainly Dr. Matiza there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Naomi Pilula. I'm from the Pensions and Insurance Authority in Zambia. Just a follow-up question on early access, and also, Mr. Gandy, in your presentation, you had mentioned one of the solutions you're proposing is giving immediate benefits, members immediate benefits in order to deal with the behavioral bias. my question is along the lines of Zambia. This year, on the first pillar national pension scheme, we did introduce early withdrawals. And I've just heard the doctor's comments in terms of the principles around early access. Now, my question is along the lines of how do you then deal with correcting a behavioral bias that has now come in terms of getting early access, and that then feeding a need for people to want more, as opposed to this being a stopgap. It becomes an issue of, okay, we want more of this access, as opposed to just dealing with the immediate needs. That's number one. But also dealing with the aspect of how does this, how do you deal with giving people, and this is specifically for Mr. Gandy, how do you deal with giving people access for immediate needs, but also ensuring there is preservation for a pension? So benefits for immediate needs, but also ensuring benefits for pension.
I think let's have the three questions. There's one at the end there. Yes.
Thank you, Doc, Moderator. I'm John Mura from Ghana. I want to ask Dr. Farouk about the situation in Nigeria, as to whether you are having pressures from your industry players on mark-to-market valuations based on the inflation that has actually moved from 400 naira to now just about 1,000. So I just want to know, and what perhaps the regulator is doing, or collaborations that are being made to actually look at those valuations, or does it bring any valuation challenges to the industry, and how you are looking at it? My next suggestion has to do with the case where you have economic challenges, just as we recently had in Ghana, and then your asset allocation. I mean, you have investment guidelines giving the various asset classes and allocation. And you are trying to nudge people from, for example, a GOG, sovereign instruments, and the assets are virtually not there for you to diversify into, for example, the alternatives and all that. What are some of the issues, or some of the considerations that you would have to make? Because yes, they are in Ghana, for example, the trustees have a responsibility to actually provide safe and fair returns, and then by going by also the investment policy that is actually offered by the regulator. But then that is what you have. You have given us an allocation of, say, 70% for GOG and others. They have actually done it in line with that, and they've actually gone, overexposed to GOG per your own guideline. But you want to also nudge the industry to diversify because of the crisis. But the products are not there. So these are some of the challenges that maybe I would want to also engage on. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am a trustee and I am a pensioner. Now, what is worrying me is people are talking about members having early access. Now, pensioners also need access. I may need medical attention. I'm a pensioner. I may have retired before finishing paying for my house, and the threat of repossession is there. Now, I'm glad I'm talking to regulators. Please don't leave out pensioners in some of these discussions. Pensioners also need access. One may say, as if you become a pensioner, maybe you are left with very few years to survive. Therefore, we don't give you money. But we have actuaries in virtually every fund has an actuary. They can be used to see how much a pensioner can be given to save his house, or how much a pensioner can be given to pay for medication. You may need an operation which requires a substantial amount of money, and I'm on pension. Why can't legislators or regulators yourselves think about how to assist pensioners and not members only? Thank you.
Yes, I just want to say, Mr. Matiz, I think indeed pensioners are a really key stakeholder, Dr. Darius, in our discussions. And I can tell you that in Zimbabwe, we're actually seized with how we can have a structured engagement with our pensioners so that we can hear their voice. Yeah, we're engaging with asset managers, we are engaging with fund administrators, but we don't quite have an association for pensioners so that we can engage with them and they can have voice. So I totally hear where you're coming from. I'll ask Gandy, and then I'll ask Dr. Farouk to come in.
Thank you. So the question is really centered around how do you manage the conflicting interests of accessing your fund credits for emergency and other purposes on the one end, but also building wealth for retirement purposes. I guess the way to look at it is to start by realizing that the industry is evolving, and also to understand what then made some jurisdictions to even consider that prior to retirement, a member could actually access part of their fund credits. I'll give you a few examples. So in one jurisdiction, for instance, people would go all the way to resigning because they wanted to access a third of their fund credits. And the law that has now been enacted is that a member, without having to resign, can actually access up to about 25% of their fund credits. So there is a solution to a problem that obviously the industry was grappling with. But it goes to worse than that. In some instances, because the law in that particular jurisdiction allows at the point of divorce for spouses to split their pension fund credits into two halves, with the one spouse who is not in part of the non-member spouse taking the 50%. We have had instances where a couple would go all the way to claim that they've just divorced, so that the spouse, the non-member could access the 50%, which they obviously then would spend together. So if you look at it from that context, you suddenly realize that there was a real problem that the industry was sitting with, and somebody needed to come up with brilliant ideas and clever ideas of how to solve that. So that's then what has driven to where we are now. And like I said earlier on, it sounds a bit unconventional, that you are actually allowing members to access their fund credits, which they should be building for retirement, but you are in the meantime allowing them to access it prior to retirement. The reasons are basically what I have highlighted, two of the many other reasons. And the way to deal with that is obviously also to simultaneously, as you introduce access prior to retirement, but you also make a lot of emphasis on preservation. In fact, you make it into law that even when a member does resign, that they cannot even probably access even the third, because they would have accessed 25% of their fund credits already. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, the issue of valuation challenge, I don't think this is a valuation challenge as far as the actual instruments are concerned, because it's the value of the currency that is devalued because of this decision of the government, and it cut across all instruments, the capital market and so on. So if you look at moving mark to market or holding to maturity, I mean, the pension funds can be very clever on these issues. And we have noticed over time that whenever the economy flipped the other way, they just change the valuation style. Just redenominate, okay, this is held to maturity, or this is going to be mark to market. And we decided we need to stop that and make it more structural, so that you classify a bond either as held to maturity or mark to market based on the objective of the fund, either fund 1 to 6, regarding, and depending on the liquidity needs of the fund. So you have to plan at the very beginning based on, whether you are going to mark these bonds to market or you are going to hold them to maturity, and then we don't allow you to really switch over just like that. So that way we ensure that we're not just playing with the value, but with the actual holdings as themselves. Yes, there is need for alternatives, and we're working on these alternatives. In fact, one of the initiatives on the corporate strategy is, as pension regulator, to see whether we could work with other regulators on developing this, developing this instrument. So that will be part of the decision at the very beginning, because one thing that we don't actually allow is that we have quality requirement, both quantitative and qualitative, and we don't joke with those. Even with government, I mentioned about the Nigeria Infrastructure Investment Fund. And when we went, I personally participated in that project with one of the state governors chairing the committee and some ministers, including the central bank governor. And they were saying, just give us 20% of the pension assets. We want to invest in infrastructure because our regulation says so. We'll say, okay, no problem. This, you should consider this money not as, as government pension, because people are thinking that because pension was unfunded before and government provides the funding, and because government is making 12% contribution into the retirement savings accounts of the account holders of its employees, then they felt that they could come and just take the money. Well, I say no. Once it's just like you have given somebody's salary into his account. You can't go and collect that salary that you paid. And more so in this case, the law has made it impossible for even the Supreme Court to actually give a judgment against the money in the retirement savings account. So government, you can't touch it. However, as I mentioned earlier, you have two options. Either you go and borrow to build this infrastructure, or you can get these things done in a fair and transparent manner, do some concessions. The people that were concessioned this infrastructure, they can then raise funds, and they need to issue papers that we want you, government, to actually guarantee. And you're not only guaranteeing the papers that are issued, but also the return. Whatever return that is placed on those papers, government, you must guarantee. So you are just guaranteeing, but by guaranteeing, you ensure that nobody does anything bad with that money. So you either choose this way, or you go and borrow from wherever you want to borrow and you build. And we had this agreement that we're going to do it this way. Unfortunately, we haven't yet been able to implement that, but all the work has been done. So we want to do alternatives, and that's why in my discussion, I mentioned about private equity was supported by the Commonwealth Secretariat to be able to do some work on that. So we have the private equities on board now. We're allowing pension funds to invest up to 5% in these PEs, and we definitely will increase the percentage when the PE business is grounded in the country.
Yes, you can come in, Dr. Padla. Do you want to add to this?
I would like to answer two questions they were asked.
Okay.
The first one, somebody asked about how you prevent the behavioral bias to wanting more and more money. That is the issue I said before. If you legislate and have it in the legislation, that behavioral bias, yes, we still have it, but it won't happen, and to some degree. The answer to the person that say, what about early access for people who are already retired, the retirees? I was talking with somebody from Botswana, just the coffee break, and we were talking about how to structure the payout phase. If the recommendation in the OECD recommendation for the good design is to have a drawdown and a deferred annuity to cover for the longevity tail risk. If you have a drawdown, that drawdown is the money stays in the pension fund. So the legislation of early access for personal dear circumstances still apply, and they can do it. If when they retire they decide to buy a life annuity, the problem is much more complicated because this is a contractual issue. But that's why we recommend to have a combination of drawdown, money staying in the pension fund, and a deferred life annuity. And that issue is addressed with that recommendation.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, unfortunately, we must end here, but thank you very much. Thank you for your listening, and do have a pleasant evening.